Well, hi everyone, welcome back to the Coalition for Marriage YouTube channel. Those of you who are joining us for the first time, as I always say, wonderful to have you with us and great to have you back again if you're joining us again. We've got a repeat guest today, the wonderful Professor W. Bradley Wilcox, who is director of the United States National Marriage Project. He's a esteemed university professor. He's a scholar with the Institute of Family Studies and is an expert on all things marriage and the data supporting the benefits of marriage, etc., etc. Now, the Institute of Family Studies have recently, hot off the press, a report on the value of marriage to society and also the happiness that's generated from marriage above and beyond other types of relationships. So it's great to have Brad with us today. Brad, it's a real pleasure to talk to you again, an absolute pleasure. I know you're a busy guy, so let's get straight into it. Now, we were going to talk today about this notion of career versus family and the idea that can you have both? Should a government get involved in promoting one or the other? And when you're looking at things like family, does policy come into it? Should a government really be involved in enacting policy that promotes family? And if so, why should it be doing it?
Yeah, great questions, Tony. It's good to be with you today. What I'm seeing, both in the US, of course, in the UK as well, and even across certainly East Asia, is a kind of what I would call a Midas mindset. And I think we all kind of know that story about King Midas, who became so obsessed with gold, with money, in a sense, power, and, like his glory as a king, which was his job, that he, made this deal with, metaphorically with the devil in a sense, to have everything that he touched turn to gold. And of course, what he didn't anticipate was that his daughter would be turned to gold. And the thing which he loved the most in the world would become, at that point, inaccessible to him. Now, at least in some versions of the story, we see that King Midas is able to kind of get this blessing, taken back and get his daughter back. And that's sort of the happy ending there, that he kind of renounces his obsession with gold and renounces this, capacity to turn everything into gold and gets his daughter back. So it's kind of an example, right? It's a parable that basically tells us that focusing in a singular way on work and money and success is a dead end, and that we should really be focusing on is, our family, our friends, the things that we love the most, and kind of serving and protecting them rather than, running after mammon. So that's sort of the King Midas story. And of course, today what we're seeing in a lot of polling and kind of how young adults are organizing their lives is kind of this singular focus on work, on career, on getting, as much education as possible. And there isn't a recognition that what matters most for us, generally speaking, is our family and our friends. And my own research indicates that, really the top predictor actually of happiness for people is a good marriage, in particular. So, and yet what we see among my students at the University of Virginia and among young adults, across much of the world, developed world, is this idea that's really about, one's job. And there's also a lot of polling data from Pew here in the US saying that that's the case too. So this is the challenge, is that there's sort of a workist mentality that's taken hold rather than what I call like a familist mentality, which sort of privilege, prioritize, marriage and family as one's primary orientation. So that's a big current out there. And I think why it's problematic is because, again, we know that when it comes to things like meaning and direction, happiness, loneliness, all these kinds of big outcomes, the quality and the character of your family relationships, your marriage especially, and then also your friendships is what matters most. And whether or not you're getting along well with your boss or your work colleague, that's important, but it pales by comparison to these other more primary relationships, Tony.
And as you mentioned, this isn't your subjective opinion. This isn't your preference. This is something the data seems to be saying. That actually, if happiness, as opposed to pure statistical wealth creation, if happiness is the goal, it seems that spending time with family and nurturing a good family brings more happiness than the alternative, which is just building up a big pile of gold.
Yeah, and the challenge with happiness, and I've got a new book coming out with HarperCollins called Get Married, just in time for Valentine's Day in February. And one of the things I talk about in the book is this idea of sort of the paradox of happiness. And that is that when we kind of directly pursue happiness, it's like that, that mirage on the edge of the desert. You think there is, some kind of water source, just out there, some kind of oasis just out there on the edge of the desert. You keep kind of heading towards it. And as you head towards it, it just keeps getting farther and farther away, basically, is what we see. The same thing's true for happiness. If you're kind of directly pursuing, I think, happiness, odds are you're not going to find it. But if you're doing things like cultivating, a good marriage, being a good friend, being engaged in your community, but also, of course, doing a good job at, at your vocation, your job, whatever that might be, or some other kind of meaningful hobby, you're more likely to kind of derive a sense of happiness from being with and serving others, or kind of developing some kind of talent that you have. So I think we just have to recognize that when it comes to happiness, one of the foundational pieces there is related to the fact that we're social animals, as Aristotle said, social animals. And so when we have good social relationships, in terms of marriage and family especially, we're more likely to flourish. But those relationships kind of are most likely to be doing well when we are, committed, when we have a spirit of generosity to our spouse and our kids, and we're kind of doing the the sort of the whole vocation of family well. And I think a lot of young adults are not thinking in that way, and they're not kind of learning the skills that will prepare them to be a good spouse and prepare them to be a good parent, and that's a big challenge today.
Absolutely. So I interviewed a lady called Stella Morabito a while ago, and she's written a book on the weaponization of loneliness. And the interesting conversation there was, a lot of our policymakers are, generally speaking, happily married. Yep, they know the benefits of marriage, and they get married, and they stay married, and they raise their families well, etc., etc. Yet the rhetoric coming out is often very, very different, that actually those things aren't important. Live the life, the kind of Rousseauian thing, connections are meaningless, just go and enjoy yourself sort of thing, and it doesn't really matter. What's behind all that? Because it almost seems as if what they're saying, and I know you've written on this before, that they talk left, but they live right, as in, small c conservative right, even though their rhetoric might be left of centre. So what's behind all that, do you think?
Yes, there is a kind of a pervasive pattern among many elites, both in the United States and in the United Kingdom, where they talk left and walk right. And I think that there are a number of dynamics playing out here. I think when it comes to sort of one's public messaging and one's thinking about a public ethic, there's a desire to be progressive, to kind of to embrace the latest thing, whatever that thing is. There's a desire to be understandably tolerant and accepting of a wide range of people in your constituency, perhaps, or in the public at large. And so reluctance to kind of say anything clear about marriage for that reason. And there's also, I think, a kind of a desire to, basically, kind of fit in with one's peers. And I'm saying this is even kind of conscious or even always deliberate, obviously, but, and there's just sort of the sense that, speaking strongly for marriage, speaking strongly for kind of the institutional autonomy of the family is, retrograde, is backwards, is biased. And so publicly, a lot of our leaders are either denying or, playing the value of marriage and family, but because I think there is a desire on the part of the human heart to have, a spouse and to have a good family. When it comes to their own private lives, they get married and, raise their kids in a stable marriage, and do what they can to keep that marriage alive. Yeah. And because they have more money, they have more assets, they often have better social skills when it comes to conflict and compromise than many other Americans or Brits. They can navigate the challenges of marriage and family life without having a clear kind of normative framework that would help guide their marriages and their families. So they don't rely as much on custom and tradition and community and church, as would have been the case, say 50 or 60 years ago. And they can kind of just navigate the challenges of family life today successfully with all of their money and all of their social skills. But the problem is because they have kind of abandoned the family as an institution, oftentimes, all the norms and customs and traditions that helped ordinary people do all this are much weaker. And partly as a consequence, the success that working class and middle class Americans and English men and women, have is much diminished today as compared to what, some other point. And I'm not saying we should turn back to 1955, obviously. I'm just saying that what we do need kind of going forward here, Tony, is a revival of norms about commitment, norms about, having kids in marriage, norms about fidelity, that would allow people to sort of navigate more successfully all this.
Yeah, you raise so many valid and vital points there, Brad. Not least of which that it's the less well-off in society who could really do with the benefits of marriage, who are listening to the rhetoric and not getting married or getting divorced in higher numbers. And so although marriage has gone down across the board, although people are getting married later in life across the board, it's not evenly demographically split. So you do have people who are less well-off, less likely to marry than they might have been in the past because it's now socially acceptable just to, do what you want with life, because that seems to be the rhetoric. And for their sake, if nothing else, yes, the middle class too are suffering, but the less well-off could really do with some kind of push towards the benefits of marriage, that this is actually a good thing to do earlier on in life. You're healthier, you're wealthier, you're happier, you live longer, you recover better from operations, your kids grow up better, they're more functioning members of society, they're less likely to get involved in the criminal justice system. Everyone's a winner. So why don't we promote it more?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, this is the challenge, is that the benefits of marriage are, in my view, actually only kind of increasing. The Institute for Family Studies, where I'm affiliated, is releasing a report in a few days, basically, that indicates that marriage matters more than ever for our children. And we're looking at data related to college graduation and economic success in young adulthood in this, basically report, and comparing boomers and millennials. And we're just seeing kind of the power of a stable family at your back for young adults today is stronger for these two outcomes than it was for baby boomers. And we're also seeing in other research done by people at NYU and at Vanderbilt a kind of similar story when it comes to things like, college graduation, educational attainment, when it comes to sort of the variability in income for families. It's much more variability for kids in single-parent families today than kids in two-parent families. And sort of the gap has grown in recent years. So what I'm saying to you, Tony, is that on a lot of outcomes, economic, social, educational, it's not just that marriage matters for our children today, but it looks like it might be mattering more than ever. I think that's in part because in today's married families, dads are much more engaged with their kids. And so having a married family gives kids, even more of that dad's influence and attention.
And that's some of your recent research showed that quite clearly, that not only are married men happier, but married fathers are happier still.
And men benefit, right? Because men benefit from being engaged with their kids as well, being present to their kids, living with their kids as well. So, anyways, the point is that it's not just that marriage matters. It looks like it, in some ways, it matters more than ever for our kids, and also, of course, in different ways for our adults. But yeah, the tragedy is that in the United States, probably the same story in the UK. What we see is that a majority of college-educated Americans are stably married. And that is not true for Americans who don't have a college degree. So there's this college divide that maps onto a marriage divide here in the US and also in important ways in the UK.
And it reminds me, it just come to my mind, a book I read quite a while ago now by Clayton Christensen, How Will You Measure Your Life? And I think he was a Harvard MBA or MIT MBA
Yeah, at
professor.
Harvard Business School. Yep.
Harvard, there you go. And again, that was a fascinating book because I think it was a book which was basically an expansion of a lecture he gave when he thought it was his last lecture because he was dying. And he's teaching captains of industry, future captains of industry. And his point was, look, how are you going to measure your life? You know, and he uses excellent business cases and connects it to kind of real life experiences about outsourcing your soul. You know, so if you're a parent, but actually you outsource all the parenting. You know, if you're a husband, but you outsource all of the time spent and the attention, you know, to other providers, are you really that parent anymore? Are you really that husband? You know, and it, really, really telling book. And you kind of feel it's necessary more than ever today, especially when, Brad, and I wanted you to touch on this, there seems to be a push in the US and in the UK to get mums back out to work as soon as possible. The idea of, well, you know, let's, as soon as you had your child almost, let's get you back into the employment and we'll provide, you know, billions towards subsidized daycare. But actually, if you choose to look after your children yourself at home and contribute in that way, you get nothing, you get no recognition at all. Which again seems to be not promoting what's best for families and best for overall outcomes.
Yeah, so I think what we have seen, you know, when it comes to discussions of family policy, Tony, is that there is this kind of assumption that family policy is about having the government take kids off the hands of their parents and kind of maximizing the parents' involvement and engagement in the workplace. And so from my perspective, this kind of approach is what we call workist. That is, it sees work as the source and summit of our lives, you know, not the family. And, you know, obviously Clayton Christensen was trying to get people to realize that at the end of your days, your family is obviously more important for you than, you know, your career and your office mates. And so the tragedy, though, is that policymakers who kind of run things tend to be very invested in their careers, very well educated. You know, they've been kind of primed their whole lives to kind of make it in the professional world. And they assume that everyone else is in that same kind of mentality. And what we've actually seen in the United States anyways, is that working class Americans are much more likely to prefer family care, whether it's mom, auntie, grandma, someone else in the family to care for their kids, less likely to want to have some kind of, you know, daycare, institutional care for their young children. And yet the policy agenda is often, you know, how can we, you know, get more and more kids into daycare, institutional care? So it's, again, more workist than it is familist. And I think that family policy should be in the business of strengthening and empowering families, giving them more time to spend with one another, giving them more resources financially to invest, you know, in their children, and recognizing the authority of parents rather than kind of giving, you know, the formational power for our kids over to, you know, some kind of educator or some kind of, you know, public official of one sort or another. So I think a genuinely kind of familist, you know, or familist family policy would be one that is about refunctionalizing family life in the UK and the United States. And when it comes to kind of the care of the young, I think the best way to do that is to kind of look at a child allowance that, you know, basically gives families resources to spend as they wish. So some would want to have a mom at home. Some would want to have maybe a mom working part-time. Some might want to have a dad at home. Others would use that on childcare. But you kind of give the family the choice about how best to rear their own young children, rather than assuming that the best option for families with young kids is to place their toddlers, and especially their babies, into, you know, care for many hours a week.
And of course, we do, depending on how you want to look at it, there is a demographic crisis, or whether it's a crisis or not. People are having fewer children. That's largely because people are getting married later, and marriage is associated with more children. So there's fewer children coming around. What can we do, Brad, to encourage? Because as you well know yourself, actually, marriage is much better when it's a cornerstone on which you build your life together, rather than a capstone, which is something you do later on in life. What can we do? Policy initiatives, other ideas. You're writing wonderful books with a very clear title, Get Married. Unambiguous. I love it, and I look forward to reading it. But what else can we do as a society, as organizations? You're doing the wonderful research, you're showing the data. What else can we do?
So I think one thing is, I think this is true both in the UK and the US, is stop penalizing marriage for many lower income families. And it's not, there's not someone, in Parliament who's bent on, penalizing marriage. There's not someone bent in Capitol Hill, just 2 hours from my office here in DC, who is bent on, penalizing marriage. Just the way in which they put together many of our benefits, many of our programs targeting lower income families end up making marriage a bad deal financially. And that is obviously insane. I mean, we are kind of making it, non-financially, rational for many of our working class couples here in the US to get married. So at a bare minimum, I think the state should recognize the importance of kind of not making marriage a bad financial decision for lower income couples and kids. So that's one thing that they could do. A second thing that they can do is to promote marriage among middle school and high school age kids. I'm not sure what the terms are in the UK, but kids who are basically ages 10 to 17. Give them a realistic
secondary school.
Right, portrait of marriage. I mean, I'm sure the vast majority of kids don't know how much a good marriage is related to their odds of being happy and financially stable, in young adulthood and in middle age, not to mention their retirement years. So kind of giving them a more accurate picture in our schools of how much marriage matters for them in their future. And I think we have to do a much better job too on social media, on reaching, our teenagers and kids on online platforms with kind of a marriage-friendly message that is compelling and accurate, not rose-colored. I think everyone knows, people who've been obviously in families know that their parents can have tough times, or their aunt and uncle, or their grandparents, whatever it might be. People gotten divorced, obviously, or never married. But just sort of saying, look, for most of us, this is the path for, meaning, direction, and happiness. And people kind of invest in their spouse and invest in their families more likely to be flourishing. So those are the kinds of things that we can do. We are hearing more calls for considering more dramatic policy options. And I think as fertility and marriage, head down even more in the UK and the United States, we'll have to kind of think about those options in more detail. But at a start, I would say, let's stop penalizing marriage. Let's start talking marriage up in our schools, and let's think about campaigns, on social media that could do a good job of kind of more accurately educating the rising generation about the benefits and the value of marriage as well.
It's brilliant, Brad. And especially everything you mentioned is, so our benefit system over here, exactly the same. If you're on benefits and you want to move in with the father of your children, you're likely to lose benefits, which kind of incentivizes having kids and bringing them up on your own. And I know that comes from a place of mercy and compassion, because you don't want single kids to grow up poor. But you have to be very careful and nuanced so it doesn't incentivize that, which is what it is does seem to be doing sometimes. And the school thing you mentioned, we've got the same kind of issues over here as you have in the States, which is more and more people are less likely to talk about marriage for fear of offending those people who aren't married, or those people who don't believe in marriage, or something else like that. But it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. We talk about you shouldn't be disrespectful, you shouldn't be disadvantageous, you shouldn't discriminate against people who are overweight. I struggle with my weight every now and then, it's just one of those things. But we don't teach kids that it's good and okay to be over, and that you should aim to be overweight or something else. We don't do that. We teach them that actually diet is good, fitness is good. But when it comes to relationships, and we know that sometimes marriages don't work out, as you say, but the overwhelming body of evidence says that actually growing up with a married mum and dad gives you the best start, bar none. And there's always cases either side that look different, but on a population basis. Yet we don't want to teach kids that in school. I just, again, I don't know why that isn't the case, Brad.
Yeah, and I think that the difference between, we at my university, there's a big push to kind of promote first generation college students, so young adults who are coming from families where their parents did not get a college degree, and there's no worries about kind of like, being sensitive to the fact that your parents didn't have a college degree in terms of encouraging you to have a college degree, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
there's
yeah.
just sort of this weird dynamic around marriage where, and I think it's part of the blame is on conservatives, right? I think there can be, classically, obviously, in many cultures, a sort of finger wagging thing, and if you've had a child outside of wedlock or you've gotten divorced, finger wag. And so I think part of the dynamic is that progressives, accurately kind of have picked up on that over the decades, and now see kind of questions about marriage as ones that are kind of about issues regarding shaming people. And I think so part of the challenge here is just kind of giving people this idea, look, everyone makes mistakes. No one's perfect. No family's perfect. We get it, right? But in general, on average, if we can do more to help people make good decisions about dating and about family formation that incorporate marriage as sort of the ideal strategy, the ideal path, for most young adults, we'd all be in a much better place in 10 years.
And that's the thing. We'd all be in a much better place.
Correct. And I think there's a lot of also people are not appreciating that, yes, there are more singles right now than ever before, and there are going to be a lot more singles in the coming decades. But even single adults benefit from strong married families in their neighborhoods, in their communities, in terms of things like public safety, for instance. So I think that what we don't appreciate enough too is that strong families don't just benefit individuals in those families, they benefit entire communities as well.
Yeah. Yeah. The other thing, of course, is strong families don't need big governments, but that's a whole other conversation. But yeah, listen, Brad, it's so good to talk to you. I very much appreciate the research you're doing. I'm looking forward very much to reading your book. Will you come and talk to us about it when it's out?
Yes, happy to come back as I said, it'll be out around Valentine's Day in February.
Great. Keep up the great work, Brad. Thank you very much for your time. Everyone, Professor W. Bradley Wilcock.
Thanks, Tony.